Hello, this section is about identity in adolescence, finding out who you are by trying on all kinds of different masks. I think if you listen to the background here where I'm recording, you'll hear some adolescence in that heightened state of excitement and play that comes around Halloween. So to get started, I'd like you to all think about yourselves. How did you decide on coming to Dene College? Think about this. Jot something down. It might be helpful. If you have a college major or a career goal that you already know, how did you make this choice? Did you explore a lot of other majors and careers before you decided on this one? Would you change it if something better came up? So you'll be advised to pause this video recording and answer these questions. So let's go back to Erikson. You're well familiar with Erikson's 8 stages of mankind, suggesting that we develop interdependently with our relations with other people. And you'll recall the steps of identity formation, beginning at the bottom with trust versus mistrust, then autonomy versus shame and doubt, autonomy versus shame and doubt in those toddler years, and the preschool years, initiative versus guilt. And then in the elementary school, industry versus inferiority, learning the value of your hard work. And now we're at the fifth stage, identity versus role confusion, or sometimes called identity diffusion. And that's, considered during the teen years, although we extend these in modern times. So let's move forward and take a look at these. So identity versus identity diffusion, typically taking place the ages of 12 to 18. And it is the opportunity to find out who you are and what one's role is in society. And this is a primary task of adolescents who need to make this wonderful transition from childhood into adulthood and know where they stand, know who they are, what kind of person they are, what kind of friends they like, what activities they enjoy, and most importantly, where they fit in, how they contribute to the greater good. So James Marcia articulates Erikson's work by suggesting that the process of developing an identity can be measured in 2 dimensions. And the first dimension is crisis, or sometimes it's just called exploration, but very often it is a crisis because the young person will lose some sleep over it. They'll go through a period of angst or turmoil. They'll have a lot of doubt and uncertainty. They might be exploring many options and talking to a lot of people to get their views. And once they make a decision, they feel calmness and a sense of relief. But these decisions are not just merely about these really big decisions like career and where to go to college, things like that. They're also just about who you are. And so we often see adolescents trying on different identities in terms of the way they dress, the way they carry themselves, the friends they choose. Maybe they are figuring out what their identity is as a moral person, and maybe they even break some laws or get themselves into trouble during adolescence as they're exploring these things. Maybe you can remember a time when you had a really weird, freaky hairdo and dressed kind of strange during adolescence as you figured out who you were. And Marcia and Erikson would say this is healthy, this period of exploration, and that sense of calmness will benefit overall the identity. And once that identity is chosen, then there's commitment. Like once a person makes up their mind where to go to college, if this has gone through a good process, they're going to be pretty determined. They're going to like their path. They've given it a lot of thought, they've explored it, and now they've made a decision. And they're happy with it. They're not doubting it. They're not going to waver or change their mind easily, and they feel confident in that decision. So as we look at these 2 dimensions, let's move on to see how they play out in the bigger model. So in this slide, you can see these 2 dimensions that we just looked at, commitment and crisis, playing out, except you can see that here, exploration is what is called crisis. So you can see that crisis is the same as exploration. Oops, we'll get that C in there. And so just a different way of saying it. And so the 2 dimensions involve looking to see whether a crisis happened. Did this person go through anything and have to come to a decision? Did they explore? And did they commit? And if both of those are present, a person explored and then committed in any area, they are thought to achieve their identity. And remember, there are many different areas. They can achieve their identity politically, but not achieve their identity socially, and that sort of thing. Now, if they have explored and they're still exploring, so exploration is present, but commitment is absent, they haven't made their decision, then they're in a state of moratorium. They're still feeling their way through. They're still finding themselves. And both Erikson and Marcia would say this is a healthy state. And once again, this exploration can be present in one area and achievement in another area. So these don't all happen at once. There are many facets of identity. If the person never explored, they never thought about other options, and they have committed, they're considered to be in identity foreclosure. And this we'll look at in a moment, but it might bode problems later on because they never went through the process of exploration or crisis. And finally, if a person is neither exploring nor committed, like they're just indifferent to it, that's called identity diffusion, and that would be somewhat of an unhealthy state in Erikson and Marcia's view. So looking at these a little more closely then, these are statuses, and these statuses can occur going down to the bottom here in many different areas, career, religion, politics. There are many more areas of identity that we could probably name if we were sitting together. These are the three that were studied by Marcia. And the first one, when the person has explored or gone through crisis and they've committed, means that they have independently arrived on a decision of identity. And so maybe they've arrived on a political view after their own pondering and contemplation, or decided on a career, or just decided on who they're going to be, what kind of friends they're going to hang around with. Now, a person who is in foreclosure, they never explored, but they committed. This is maybe the taking on of their parents' values without any real thought, or without any exploration or consideration of other options. And both of these, Erikson and Marcia, would say that this is not a true identity. They haven't really found themselves. They've just settled into the path that others shaped for them. And so they would identify this as a less healthy identity status. Number three, the state of moratorium. A person is exploring and they haven't yet committed. This is a good place to be in adolescence because it takes time to find yourself. And this person might be in crisis over some aspect of their identity, trying on different friends, different social groups, different value systems. Maybe this is an adolescent who's gotten into trouble and broken the law. They're still figuring things out. They're not committed to that identity. And most adolescents who do commit crimes do not become criminals. This is just an exploratory process. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It can happen. But a lot of adolescents do get into trouble without becoming lifelong criminals. And then finally, the identity diffusion is sort of an apathetic state. The person hasn't explored their options and they haven't committed. They're just sort of bobbing along on the water. They're kind of apathetic, they're indecisive, they're not asking questions. And this is the opposite end of Erikson's identity versus identity diffusion. And so this person might not know what their role in society is going to be because they're never exploring these things. They're not wrestling with these tough questions. Now, make note that these are not stages. A person doesn't go through these in any particular sequence, and there are lots of areas where people form an identity. And so this is a little different from the moral development or the cognitive development that we've studied before. This is just different statuses that someone can be at a certain point in time. So I have a couple videos here, but I'm not able to embed them, and so I'm not going to show either of them. We'll just kind of move through them because they can't be embedded. And I want you to think back to yourself then. What did you write down on how you decided to come to Dundee College? How did you make your choice? Did you explore a lot of other options, a lot of colleges, a lot of different careers before you chose? Would you change if something better came along? So maybe you can look at your answer to these questions and figure out where you are in terms of your identity status with relation to career. And maybe you can extrapolate that to your political identity. Have you given it a lot of thought? Have you explored? Have you made a decision independent? It can be the same decision as your parents, but have you come to that decision after contemplating? So these are the kinds of things you can think about. Now, there are other aspects of identity, and one such aspect is self-concept. And self-concept is just how you view yourself. So, like, if someone, it's maybe the answer to the question, who are you? All right, and it's pretty simple in childhood. A person might describe, say, their adjectives like I am nice, and maybe a little bit about the things they like to do. But once they reach adolescence, this self-concept becomes kind of complex. There's more details, there's more nuance in terms of who they are. More abstract, their characteristics not grounded in experience, and more differentiated, recognizing situations. And if we look at this complex image, you can see that this person has very different characteristics depending on who she's with. And so with a group of friends, the adjectives are cheerful, assertive, outgoing. With a best friend, there's a little bit different vibe, kind of comfortable, caring. Different with father and mother, with their father less open, with mother more open and at ease. And so all of these are examples of the nuance that with which an adolescent can view themselves. Now, I will bring you back to remind you of Sullivan's stages of development, and you'll recall that Sullivan says that anxiety is the most aversive state, and that a person seeks to reduce anxiety by balancing personal satisfaction with security, and that the security is based on approval of others. And so who is it that's giving the approval? Well, you know that in infancy and early childhood, it was primarily adults in infancy. It didn't matter who it was as long as it was tender. And it was adults in early childhood and somewhat those peers in middle childhood. Well, Sullivan points out that in pre-adolescence, maybe, 5th, 6th grade, the need for intimacy in same-sex friendships. There tends to be that glomming onto the same sex. Female friends, it's almost like an attached friendship. There can even be jealousy in female friendships, and male friendships tend to bond a lot on shared activities. And at early adolescence, the intimacy with the opposite sex becomes important. And so let's relate this a little bit to Cooley's model of the looking glass self, which is the aspects of the self that emerge from how we imagine others see us. Now, this doesn't mean we ask them how they see us. We just imagine how they see us. Like right now, you can probably imagine how your parents view you. And this model would suggest that you will conform to how your parents view you. So if they view you as someone who tends to be kind of giggly and not work very hard, you'll tend to be that way when you're around your parents just by virtue of imagining how they see you and becoming that person. So it works like this. Number one, we imagine how we must appear to others. 2, we imagine the judgment of that appearance, positive or negative, and then we develop ourselves through those judgments. So if you think that your parents perceive you negatively, they view you in a certain way and they judge that negatively, you might first of all inadvertently conform to that expectation, and secondly, maybe view yourself a little negatively too. Each to each a looking glass reflects the other that doth pass. Or, quoting Cooley here again, the thing that moves us to pride or shame is not the mere mechanical reflection of ourselves, but an imputed sentiment, the imagined effect of this reflection on another's mind. And so it's an interesting phenomenon that you might be able to find examples of, and that impacts teenagers quite a lot. So how does it play out in adolescence? Well, first off, in adolescence, looking at the first column, approval of others is often needed before one can approve oneself. And you become aware of these approvals from an early age, and the need for that approval persists across the lifetime. And depending on who the adolescent needs for approval, who does the adolescent need? If the adolescent goes through this period of life still wanting the approval of their parents, there's usually good outcomes. Poorer outcomes if that approval of parents is disregarded and only the approval of peers or siblings is desired. And there's a tendency for when the parenting situation isn't good for this over-reliance on peer approval, which can get a person into trouble. So parents who are coercive, rejecting, or chaotic in their parenting style tend to result in adolescents seeking peer approval. One more aspect of identity is self-esteem, and that is how good you feel about yourself. Like, do you view yourself well or not? And you might say, I am a good person. Does an adolescent typically believe in themselves that way? So baseline self-esteem is just that, how they view themselves overall. So if we did an experience sampling method, and on the bottom of this grid, we marked each hour of a day, or usually it's done at random points in the day, the person's phone beeped and they were asked, how do you feel about yourself right now? And then they did this over the whole course of a month, all these random data points. Well, if they averaged all those ratings out, they would have the baseline self-esteem. But barometric self-esteem is how much these self-esteems fluctuate. And so some people are pretty steady. Their self-esteem doesn't vary much over the course of many time samplings, but some people vary a lot. Like in this curved line here, representing barometric self-esteem, you can see this person seems to be really influenced by things that happen in their world. They're feeling really good at one moment and really bad the next moment. And this is a personality trait that can vary, but in general, these highs and lows in self-esteem are associated with adolescence and tend to settle down later. So we're going to talk now about collective identity as well, and that's the identity of your group. The identity that you feel for being part of a group. And you might think of yourself as being, say, an individual, a female, Caucasian, or Navajo for that matter, a human, and all of these categories are contained within the others. And what identity you experience at a given point in time depends on its salience in the environment. So for example, if a whole bunch of aliens came down from Earth, you might identify with the other humans, right? Or if, that might become your salient identity, human being. If you're the only Navajo person, say, or in this case, Caucasian, if you're the only Caucasian person in a whole bunch of people who aren't Caucasian, and then there's one other Caucasian person, well, you're probably going to adhere to that person and feel like a sense of being at home with that person. And the same according to gender and many other identities that we have. So we fluctuate in terms of which identity is most salient, and our individual identity is likely to be most salient with our closest friends and our closest in-group. So how do these collective identities impact us? Well, first off, does your group have a positive identity, whatever group it is? It could be your a group being women or male. It could be your race, Navajo or not Navajo. It could be your age cohort. So all these different groups that you belong to. It could be your academic group or your athletic identity, many, many identities. And if that group that you're belonging to or that is active at that point in time is positive, you gain confidence. You're bolstered. You feel better because your group is viewed favorably. If you're the member of a winning football team and you're on that team, you're going to feel better about yourself by virtue of taking on the group identity. And what if you're both a majority group? Let's picture a racial group where you're the largest in number and your group is viewed favorably. Then you don't even think about your group identity. You're not even aware of it unless something happens to make it salient, like you're no longer in the majority. But what if your group has a negative identity? What if people in the world view your group negatively? Well, then you would be thinking about it a lot. It would be salient all the time. And you might feel that people aren't even seeing you, but just your group. Kind of the way you might feel accosted by stereotypes in the border towns if you're Navajo. So this is the kind of thing that group identity can do to a person. It can really impact what aspect of your identity is salient and how you feel about yourself. So what aspects lead to a negative group identity? First off, you might have firsthand experiences. Like if you had a firsthand experience in a border town which led you to feel degraded or disrespected, that can lead to a negative group identity. Or it might be cultural. Members of the dominant group might regard their beliefs as better. It might be just conveyed throughout the culture. Or it might be institutional. Maybe you can't access the same kinds of things because of the group you belong to. It could be like if you're a woman and you couldn't access certain things that are available only for men, or it could be your race. Racial inequities. You don't have access to as good a school or as good a services or opportunities. And then collective. Members of a dominant group may actively work to restrict or deny minority group members their basic rights and privileges. And we saw that pretty overtly in, previous eras in the South especially, but I think this still happens. It might be a little more subtle now than when it was part of the law, but it still happens. I bet you would have more to say about this. So that brings to identity, ethnic development. And once again, we have these two dimensions. And I'd like to use my pen, but it doesn't line up when I record these lectures like this, so I have to just talk you through it. So first off, look here on the top left, your identification with the majority group. So if you're Navajo and the majority in this country is still white, how much do you identify with the white group? Is that identity strong or is it weak? And then the second over here in the top of the right-hand column, how much do you identify with the ethnic group, with being Navajo if you are? Do you identify strongly or weakly? And this will vary for each individual. And if you have strong identification with the majority group, white people, and strong identification with the Navajo people, then you'd be considered bicultural. If you have strong identification with white people, but weak identification with Navajo, maybe you were not raised with your people, then you might be assimilated. If you strongly identify with Navajo and you don't identify with the majority group, then within the country as a whole, you might be separated or feel separated. And if you just don't know, like maybe some of the people who were pulled out of their Navajo homes to go to boarding school and they're not a part of either group anymore, they might be marginal. They might not feel a belonging anywhere. So see where you fit here, and let's take a look at this more deeply. So we might consider these four orientations then. Assimilation, adopting the majority norms and standards and rejecting one's own group, maybe like adoptive families. Marginality, living in the majority culture but feeling estranged and outcast. Maybe some Islam people, Hispanic, Black, maybe gay families. And we already gave the example of the boarding school experience. Maybe separated. You're associating only with your own culture and you reject the majority culture. There was a school that my daughter taught at where this seemed to be the primary association or mental state. And then finally, biculturalism. You're a big part of both. Both of them are part of you and you've navigated it and you have room for both of those cultures. So then this leads us to how people handle discrimination, which is just a part of this human experience. And first off, it seems that three factors make a difference then. So first off, racial centrality. How important is your race to you in defining your identity? Where does it stand? And we already looked at the factors that might impact how central it is to your identity. And in private regard, how do you feel about being a member of that race? How do you feel? Maybe you're proud of it. Should be. But maybe not. And again, this will be based on those past experiences we already discussed. And in public regard, how do you think others view your race? Do you think others view your race favorably or unfavorably? And these three factors make a difference in how people handle discrimination. So we're going to look at this multidimensional model of racial identity, Seller's model. And so what we look at here, this is a hard chart because I have part of it covered so as not to have confusion. So we have centrality, how important or central is that race to one's identity. Private regard, how favorably do you look at your race? And public regard, how do you think others view your race? And so the first style is this buffering defensive style. And in this case, that race might be really important to you. It's a big part of how you see yourself. You never get away from it. And your private regard for your race, though, you might not look at your race that favorably yourself, and you really think others don't look at it favorably. Your public regard is quite low, negative. And that would lead to a buffering defensive style. You might tend to be defensive on racial issues. Your race is important. You feel sort of positive about it, but others view it negatively. You can see how that would bring about this defensiveness, or buffering it's called. The second is alienated. Your race isn't important to you. You don't feel positive about it, but you think others view it negatively. So here you have this really low, here's the 0 line. This is low centrality. Race isn't important. It's a little bit on the positive side how you view your own race, but you really do believe others view it negatively. So even though it's not important to you, you're still carrying some weight around with it, and that's the alienated style. Low connectedness, high affinity. Then we have an idealized look. Race is important to you. You feel positive about your own race, and you think others view your race positively. And in this case, we have the centrality and the private regard, both, on the high side, but we have a really high emphasis on how you think others view your race. So overall, your race is a good thing for you. It's working for you. And then finally, we have alienated, someone who has over here we have this low connectedness, high affinity. I put these out of order and I apologize. So I'm going to repeat these so I don't have to redo this whole recording. So this second cluster with someone who has low centrality, low public regard, high public regard, that person here is just having low connectedness to their race and high affinity for others. And this alienated style is this one where the person doesn't feel their race is very important, but they really view their race negatively. And they think a little less extreme that others view it negatively. And that's that alienated style. And I apologize for misreading that in my sequence on the right here. So maybe these styles fit to you, and these will make a difference in how a person navigates the social world around them and how they navigate the mainstream culture. This would be a great in-class discussion if we can think of a thread to talk about, especially during adolescence when these identities are forming.